Today I want to present a study that I am conducting with Krisztina Kis-Katos and Nunung Nuryartono from the universities of Göttingen and Bogor, titled "The Palm Oil and the Politics of Deforestation in Indonesia." So let's go directly to the research question. It is, how does the interaction between political and economic incentives drive deforestation? So we are very interested in this interaction between the two spheres. Of course, there are, so in Indonesia, you have it's very straightforward, this research question, as you have a very historically very prevalent corrupt administration at all levels, but you also have the rapidly expanding oil palm sector that is driving deforestation. So both spheres, the economic or agricultural incentives, have been researched, and also the political economy factors have been researched in this context. Foremost, I could highlight Burgess et al. And Alesina also studied the political economy of deforestation in Indonesia, looking at district proliferation or the splitting up of districts, seeing that competition on natural resources increase and thereby deforestation rates increase. On the other hand, Alesina also sees that district splitting leads to a reduction of ethnic heterogeneity, and thereby deforestation actually decreases. Very closely related to the study, I have to highlight Pela, who also looked at election incentives in Brazil. But let's see what we do. We also study pre-election changes in deforestation and then the interactions with palm oil induced variation in economic incentives. So it directly links to the large political, business and budget cycle literature, and which describes that mostly effects are driven at before elections rather than after elections. For example, in our context, it would be that politicians want to signal economic competence before elections, trying to foster the agricultural sector, trying to give out more agricultural credit subsidies or fertilizer subsidies, and by that deforestation would increase. Another mechanism would be that politicians are needing natural resources to fund actually their election campaigns. In Indonesia, that would work via giving out extra licenses to deforest or issuing concessions for oil palm plantations, timber plantations, and logging plantations. But it could also be that politicians just diverge resources and efforts to organize elections, coming up elections, and their own electoral campaign, and thereby neglecting the monitoring and enforcement of environmental laws. So all these mechanisms would be stronger in times and places where palm oil incentives are higher. Because if you imagine politicians have multiple strategies at hand, they could either focus their efforts at the agricultural sector, or they could focus their efforts, for example, on the mining sector, or the trying to capture funds from infrastructure projects. So it would, under multiple strategies, they would choose those strategies that are more promising in order to get re-elected. And thereby, if incentives for palm oil increases, prices for palm oil increases, we would expect stronger effects in pre-election years when incentives are high. So the research approach is straightforward. We have spatio-temporal data on location and the type of forest losses. We use crop suitability maps and interact those with global price fluctuations, which gives a measurement of agricultural incentives across time and space. And then we have a quasi-random timing of district elections, which I will talk about in a minute again. And what we see in the end is that economic and political incentives strongly reinforce each other. showing you a little bit about the data. So we have newly deforested area between 2001 and 2016 at a pixel level, and we collapsed this data to the district level, having yearly measurements of forest losses, and we use the inverse hyperbolic sine, which is basically a logarithmic transformation as our main outcome. Then, for the economic incentives, we use suitability maps for palm oil here, and we also collapse those to the district level, and which gives us a measurement, an indice of how profitable it is to produce palm oil at each district S. And we interacted these indices at the district level with the global agricultural crop price fluctuations, or so to say, the deviation from the past average price. So this interaction effect between suitability and prices then gives us a price exposure measurement that varies across districts and time. It's a very similar approach to shift share, quasi-experimental shift share approaches, just that a varying timing of local elections, which comes from the fact that after the fall of the Suharto regime in 1998, we saw Indonesia introduced elections in a staggered fashion. So old mayors were still allowed to finish their 5-year term, and which introduced a different timing of the first democratic elections at the district level. Later on, they changed to direct elections, so from parliament voting to direct, so that the mayor was elected directly by the electorate. So this gives us really an idiosyncratic timing of elections across time, and you can still see the 5-year cycle across the whole time period. So the empirical approach then is straightforward. We look at deforestation on the left-hand side, yearly deforestation. And on the right-hand side, we have an election dummy, which is one in election year. And in this specification, we will focus just before elections, so one lead dummy before elections. We could also introduce more of the election dummies 2 years before, 3 years before, and 1 year after. But now let's focus on the 1 year before elections. Then we have our price exposure variable, and what we are most interested in is the interaction effect between those variables. So to say, how does deforestation change in districts that face upcoming elections and have high palm oil price incentives. We control for the district splitting process. We control for differential time trends depending on initial conditions, such as initial forest size and soil suitability. And of course, we also control for the district and time year effects. So the main results are basically those. We have the pre-election dummy, and you will see a 5% increase in deforestation just before elections happen. We also see a strong price effect of the palm oil price exposure, and we see that 8% more deforestation in those years where districts experience high incentives. And more importantly, then we have our interaction effect, which is also strong and positive. In total, that would mean that we have a 18% higher deforestation in those districts that are facing elections the next year and have a high prices in that year, or where prices are increasing. So of course, there's some identification issues at hand. Yeah? One would be deviations from the 5-year cycle that could come from corrupt mayors having to give up. We control for the district splitting process. We also show that restricting to very regular 5-year cycles doesn't have any effect on our estimates. Stronger critique comes from the new literature on shift share approaches. We also address those, the correlated errors, or the non-exogenous shares of shares. So the shares are once again the soil suitability indices, and the shifters are the prices. So we do control for soil suitability and differential trends, and we don't see any relation between suitability and elections in pre-period times and pre-treatment period times. So more importantly, what I want to talk about is the endogeneity of the prices, right? So of course, Indonesia doesn't have exogenous prices, as it's the main producer of palm oil in the world. So, but this actually helps us, because if prices increase and leads to more deforestation, and deforestation would thereby lead to palm oil expansion, the supply would increase, which would again downward bias the price, downward drive the price, and therefore we have a underestimated effect in our main specification. We look into trying to control for the downward bias with an IB strategy, which is basically to use an instrument for palm oil prices as the suitability times a trade-weighted global GDP. What it means is basically we try to filter out the supply shock by instrumenting with something that is more leaned towards the demand driven, right? So once we control for demand and filter out the supply effect in the prices, we get higher prices as we would expect, right? So supply doesn't change, and therefore we estimate a higher effect. So I wouldn't interpret this as a causal estimate. I would interpret it as an upper boundary of the effect, right? And the other one, our main specification, as a lower boundary of the causal effect. If we compare the palm oil price exposure and its interaction with all other crop prices, here weighted average of about 20 crops, we see that also other crops drive deforestation up, but they do not have a significant effect with the pre-election year. So to say that there is no political incentive that plays a role for other crops when compared to the very strong effect of palm oil. So the political incentives are really focusing on the very predominant palm oil industry. We go also dig into the political mechanisms, where we look into direct versus indirect elections, first versus second term mayors. We don't see any systematic differences. We also look into other outcomes, such as the area expansion of wood fiber concessions and logging concessions. We see some results there, but unfortunately, we don't have any information on the expansion of oil palm concessions by itself. So what we have is the location of oil palm concessions and the location of the other concession types. So we can classify the forest losses into those areas they fall into. So to say the future area that is going to be a concession for. So we have forest losses now as an outcome, but only those forest losses that are in the final concession area in 2016, yes, oil palm, logging, and fiber concessions. And here we see in comparison that the strongest effects actually are in the oil palm concessions, right? So, and less so in the other concession types. If you noticed here, we have at baseline a negative effect. So if we try to interpret this, it would mean that when there are low prices or average palm oil prices, the baseline effect actually reduces deforestation on those oil palm concessions. So it could be that this is due to a spatial spillover. Deforesters are focusing away from palm oil concessions and are deforesting on other areas. Or it could be that politicians just don't focus their activities on the palm oil sector, but rather on other sectors at baseline.
2 minutes remaining.
3 minutes, that's good.
2.
2, yes.
2.
So land use, we also look into different ecological differences, and we have here see that the highest effects on high yield areas, and we also see strong economic political interactions on future oil palm plantations. So basically, in sum, we see palm oil prices matter, elections matter, they both reinforce each other. And there's some politics behind, and we see also some increases in licenses after elections, which could indicate that for elections and legalizing them after elections. All right, so I have finished, and I just wanted to promote a little bit my future project, which is funded by the EU, from human to planetary health, where I will analyze the global land use impacts on from the COVID-19 pandemic in its economic and also political dimensions, and possibly will also organize a workshop in 2 years. So if you are planning to go into this research direction, I would be happy to collaborate or to interchange. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss.